Okay, so picture this. You're prepping for the IELTS speaking test. And you know that feeling, right? The pressure, especially when it comes to part one. It's all about that first impression, but where do you even begin? Well, we've got you covered. Today we're doing a deep dive into what an IELTS expert has to say so you can totally nail that first encounter with the examiner.
Right on. I'm Keith O'Rondell.
Ow.
I've been teaching IELTS for years now with the IELTS Speaking Success Program.
And his course is full of really practical tips and some surprising insights that we're going to unpack today. So we're going way beyond the usual generic advice and give you strategies you can actually use. So you walk into that test feeling confident and prepared for an actual conversation, not like you're reciting some memorized robot script.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, get caught up in using really complex vocabulary right away. But that's not what part one's about at all.
So then what is it about? If it's not about showing off your big words, what's the examiner really looking for?
Part one is all about clear and accurate communication. Imagine this. You've just met someone new and you want to make a good impression, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to launch into your whole life story, all your deepest thoughts and feelings in those first few minutes.
No, definitely not. That would be a little intense.
Exactly. It's the same with the IELTS speaking test.
Mm-hmm.
Don't overthink it. Those first couple sentences are your chance to show you can communicate simple ideas clearly and accurately.
It's like setting the stage.
Exactly. If you make a bunch of basic grammar errors right off the bat, the examiner might think your English isn't strong, even if you do know a lot of fancy words. I tell my students it's like spilling tomato sauce all over your shirt the second you meet someone.
I love that. You'd be so focused on that stain you wouldn't even hear what the person was saying.
It's the same with grammar mistakes. They can really distract the examiner from everything else you're trying to say.
Okay, so we want to avoid that tomato sauce effect at all costs. What's the best way to do that?
Keep it simple. Use short, clear sentences. Focus on getting it right. And don't be afraid to pause. Think for a second before you speak.
Okay, good advice. Now, one of the classic part one questions is about your hometown. How should we approach that?
So you'll hear the examiner using what's called signposting. Basically, they use specific phrases to guide you. They'll often say something like, let's talk about your hometown. That's your cue to zero in on that topic.
What I think trips people up is that hometown isn't always so straightforward. What if you've moved around a lot, or your hometown and where you live now are totally different?
That's a great point. A lot of test takers get stuck on which town they're supposed to talk about. But honestly, the examiner isn't super interested in all the details about your town. They want to see if you can talk about a town in general. Describe it. Share your opinions. Use vocabulary. That makes sense.
So it's more about showing your language skills than giving a geography lesson.
Exactly. So if you've moved, go ahead and talk about the city you live in now. Just be clear about it. You could say something like, I've been living in city name for a number of years.
That's a good tip. Using that present perfect continuous I've been living subtly shows the examiner you've got a handle on grammar without making it sound like you're trying too hard.
Exactly. Now, another question you'll likely get is, what's the most interesting part of your town? This one makes a lot of people freeze up.
It does feel like you have to come up with something super profound.
Right. But again, it's not about being a tour guide or giving a history lecture. It's about your personal opinion. Back it up with a few details, and you're good.
So how do we tackle this question in a way that's authentic, but still showcases our language skills?
I suggest using a simple template. Something like, for me, the most interesting part is probably blank. Because blank. Fill in the blanks with your opinion and your reasons, for example. The most interesting part for me is probably the historical district, because it's full of these beautiful old buildings, and I love learning about the area's history.
I like that template. It gives you a structure so you don't ramble. Plus, you're sure to hit those key points. State your opinion, give reasons, and toss in some specifics.
Exactly. Now, moving on from your town, the examiner will probably ask about your home. And this is where a lot of test takers fall into the trap of sounding too formal.
Because we think about how we'd write about our home, not how we'd actually talk about it.
Exactly. Spoken English is different. It's more relaxed, more informal, and it uses different words and grammar.
So how do we practice sounding more natural when we talk about our home in English? That's a pretty specific scenario to practice, isn't it?
One thing you can do is record yourself answering those typical home-related questions. Think about what they might ask. Do you live in a house or a flat? Who do you live with? What's your favorite room? While? Things like that. Answer them out loud, record yourself, and then listen back.
Okay, and then what? Like critique our pronunciation.
Here's the interesting part. Instead of listening for mistakes, Transcribe what you said, but don't write it down word for word. Break it down into what we call chunks of meaning.
Chunks.
A chunk is just a group of words that express a single idea. So instead of transcribing, I live in a small apartment with my 2 roommates, you'd write small apartment, 2 roommates.
I see. So it's about those key pieces of information, not the grammar.
Right. And this is going to help you loosen up your language, make it sound more natural. So for example, instead of my living room is decorated with a large, comfortable sofa and a beautiful antique coffee table, you could say, my living room's got this comfy sofa and there's this cool old coffee table.
Okay. I hear the difference. The second one definitely sounds more like how I'd actually talk about my living room.
Exactly. And the more you practice this chunking thing, the more you'll notice those little differences between written English and how people actually speak.
This is great advice, especially for people who tend to over-prepare and end up sounding too rehearsed. It's all about finding that sweet spot between accuracy and sounding natural.
Absolutely. And don't forget to have fun with it. The more you enjoy speaking English, the more confident and fluent you'll sound.
Speaking of sounding natural, another tip you have is about using more specific language when describing your home.
Yeah, instead of just table, say IKEA table, or wooden table, instead of paintings, describe them as portraits, landscapes, or abstract paintings.
That makes sense. The more specific you are, the more vocabulary you're showing off. Plus, it helps the examiner actually picture your home in their mind.
Exactly. It's all about painting a vivid picture with your words.
All right, so we've talked about hometown,
Yeah.
home. Now, what about work or studies? What should we focus on when the examiner asks about our job or field of study?
Once again, it's not about impressing them with your fancy job title or achievements. It's about explaining your daily tasks clearly and accurately, and using vocabulary from your field.
What are some common mistakes people make when they talk about their work?
One common mistake is trying to squeeze in too much information. They list every single thing they do, and it ends up sounding like a boring job description.
So how do we avoid that? How much detail is enough?
I recommend sticking to 2 or 3 main tasks, and then add some details about each one.
And how do we choose which tasks to highlight?
Think about the tasks that are most related to your field, and the ones you're most comfortable talking about in English.
Okay, so let's say I'm a software developer. I wouldn't rattle off every coding language I know. I'd pick maybe 2 or 3 key projects I've worked on.
Exactly. And for each project, you could talk about a specific challenge you faced, or a skill you used. This shows the examiner that you can go beyond just listing tasks and actually explain what you do.
That's a much more interesting way to talk about your work. You're telling a story instead of reciting a list.
Right. Now, another question you might get about work is, what would you like to change about your job?
Ooh, this one always makes me nervous, like they're trying to trick you into complaining.
I know what you mean, but this is your chance to show off your diplomacy and your problem-solving skills. It's not an invitation to rant about everything you hate.
So how do we answer this without sounding negative or unprofessional?
Focus on expressing your dislikes in a diplomatic way, and always finish on a positive note. So instead of, I hate the long hours and the lack of recognition, you could say, while I enjoy the challenges of my role, I would appreciate more flexibility in my work schedule. However, I really value the supportive team environment and the opportunities for professional development my position offers.
That's much better. You're acknowledging what you'd like to change, but you're also highlighting the positive.
Exactly. It shows you can think critically about your job and express your opinions professionally and constructively.
And what about the work environment question? What aspects should we focus on when describing our workplace?
It's not just about describing the physical space. It's about the atmosphere and how you interact with your colleagues. Use contrasting vocabulary to really paint a picture.
What do you mean by contrasting a vocabulary?
For example, you could describe a stressful workplace as high pressure, demanding, or competitive. But a more relaxed workplace might be supportive, collaborative, or laid back.
Those are great examples. Using that specific vocabulary shows you've got a good range.
Exactly. The more descriptive you are, the better the examiner can understand your work environment.
All right, let's switch gears and talk about those study-related questions. If you're a student, the examiner will probably ask you about your chosen subject. What's the most important thing to keep in mind here?
The key question is usually, why did you choose this subject? And this can be tricky, especially if you didn't exactly have a choice.
You mean like if your parents chose it for you?
Exactly. That's the reality for a lot of students. But honesty is always the best policy on the IELTS. Don't make up a story about being passionate about something if you're not.
So how do we handle that situation without sounding like we're blaming our parents?
You can acknowledge their influence,
Yeah.
but also highlight how your own interest has grown. So you could say, my parents encouraged me to go into this field because they saw potential in me. At first, my interest came from them, but now I've developed a real passion for it because, and then you explain what specifically interests you.
That's a good way to frame it. You're being honest, but you're also showing you can think for yourself and that you're taking responsibility for your education.
That's exactly what they're looking for. Maturity and self-awareness, not just textbook answers.
Okay, so we've covered a ton in part 1, hometown homework studies. But before we move on to part 2, I want to talk about something that can really throw people off. What happens if the examiner asks you a question you've already answered?
Oh, that's a great question. It happens more than you'd think. It can really throw people off.
Because it feels like you messed up, like you weren't clear enough the first time.
That's right. But sometimes the examiner is doing this on purpose to see how you handle repetition, just like in a normal conversation. Remember, the IELTS is supposed to test how you communicate in real-life situations. And in real life, we repeat ourselves all the time.
True. So instead of freaking out, how do we gracefully deal with that situation?
Well, instead of just repeating your old answer word for word, use it as a chance to rephrase and elaborate. You could say something like, as I mentioned earlier, or, well, as I was saying, and then rephrase your answer using slightly different words or adding a new detail.
That's a good tip. It shows you're paying attention and that you can adapt your language to keep the conversation flowing smoothly.
Exactly. It's about being flexible and thinking on your feet.
Okay, so we've covered so much ground in part 1, and I feel like I've already learned so much from your insights. But before we jump into part 2, I want to give our listeners a moment to think about something we discussed earlier. The importance of sounding natural.
Right, that's the key to part 1. Relax. Be yourself and let your personality shine through.
That's right.
Relaxing and being yourself is key for part 1. And that carries over into part 2 as well.
Perfect segue, because now we're moving on to part 2, which is sometimes called the long turn. I know it can feel intimidating, but it's really your chance to shine and show off how well you can tell a story.
I agree. I always tell my students, it's not about memorizing a perfect answer. It's about being able to speak spontaneously and engagingly for a longer period of time.
So how can our listener prepare for that without feeling totally overwhelmed?
Well, first, let's break down what part 2 actually involves. You'll get a cue card with a topic and some prompts to guide you. You'll have 1 minute to make some notes, and then you'll have to speak on that topic for about 2 minutes.
Oh, yeah. I remember that feeling of getting the cue card, and my mind would just go blank. Talk about pressure.
It's totally normal to feel that way. But the examiner isn't expecting you to be like a world-class speaker. They just want to see how well you can organize your thoughts, tell a story, and speak fluently for a couple of minutes.
So what are some good strategies for making the most of that 1 minute of note-taking time? It feels like it just vanishes.
Don't try to write down whole sentences. You'll waste too much time. Instead, jot down keywords and phrases, things that'll jog your memory and help structure your response. It's like creating a mental roadmap for your story.
I love that. A roadmap for your story. What kind of things should we include on our mental map?
I tell my students to think about the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Write down a few points for each of those. That'll give your story depth and make it easier to understand.
Okay, so like if the cue card says, describe a memorable journey, my notes might be, family road trip, Yellowstone, got lost, funny mishaps, learned about nature, felt adventurous, stuff like that.
Exactly. Those keywords will help you stay on track and make sure your story flows. Now let's talk about time management. 2 minutes can go by really fast when you're in the spotlight.
It's true. It's easy to get caught up in your story and suddenly realize you've only talked about half of what's on the cue card.
That's why practice is so important. Set a timer for 2 minutes and practice talking about different things. Record yourself and listen back. How much did you cover in that time? Did you hit all the points on your imaginary cue card? This will help you get a feel for your pacing and adjust as needed.
That's a good tip. Now you've talked about using different grammar and vocabulary in part 2. How can we do that without sounding like we're trying too hard?
Remember, the goal is to make your story better, not to show off. So don't force in complicated grammar just because. Focus on using a mix of tenses that fit naturally with what you're saying.
Can you give us an example of how to use different tenses in part 2?
Sure. Let's say you're talking about a past trip. You'll probably use the past simple tense to describe the main events. But you could also throw in some present perfect to talk about how that trip has affected you, or even future tenses to talk about how it's influenced your travel plans going forward.
I see what you mean. Those subtle changes in tense can make your story more interesting and show the examiner you know your grammar without sounding like you're reading from a textbook.
Exactly. It's about showing your range without sacrificing clarity. Same goes for vocabulary.
Any advice on using impressive vocab without sounding like we're just reading a thesaurus? That's something a lot of people worry about.
Brainstorm vocabulary beforehand. Think about the theme of your story and jot down words and phrases that come to mind. So if you're talking about travel, you might write down words like itinerary, picturesque, cultural immersion, or off the beaten path.
I like that. So instead of scrambling for fancy words on the spot, you've got a mental toolbox ready to go. But you're not just throwing those words in randomly. You're using them thoughtfully and naturally within your story.
Exactly. The key is to choose words that make your story better and show off your vocabulary. But don't force them in.
Okay, I'm loving these practical tips. You always say that part 2 is about more than just language skills. It's also about connecting with the examiner and letting your personality come through.
Absolutely. The IELTS speaking test is about communication. And communication isn't just words. It's body language, tone of voice, and making a real connection.
So how can our listener make that connection with the examiner, especially in a high-pressure situation?
It sounds simple, but make eye contact. Smile. Use natural intonation and gestures, just like you would in any conversation. Don't be afraid to add some humor or personal touches to your story. Let your passion for the topic shine through.
So treat it like a conversation, not a formal presentation.
Exactly. Imagine you're telling a story to a friend over coffee. You'd be relaxed, engaging, and your personality would come out naturally. Try to bring that same energy to the IELTS.
Okay, now what about those moments when our minds go blank? Or we hit a snag in our story? That's going to happen, right?
It's going to happen. Don't panic. It happens to everyone. Take a breath, pause for a second to gather your thoughts, and try to rephrase or summarize what you've already said. That'll buy you some time.
So if I totally lose my train of thought, I could say something like, so as I was saying, this trip really had a big impact on me because, and then use that pause to get back on track.
Exactly. You can also use filler words like, or, well, to show your thinking. Don't be afraid of those little pauses and hesitations. They're normal.
That's good to hear. I think a lot of test takers think they have to speak perfectly from start to finish, and that just adds more stress.
Perfection isn't the goal. The goal is to communicate effectively. And that's about being clear, engaging, and being yourself.
Love that advice. Okay, before we go on to part 3, any last words of wisdom for our listener as they get ready for part 2?
Practice, practice, practice. And don't just practice speaking, practice thinking. Read about lots of different topics and start thinking about how you would approach them on the IELTS.
That's great advice. It's not just about memorizing vocab or grammar rules. It's about training your brain to think critically and creatively in English.
Exactly. The more you do that, the more confident and fluent you'll become. Remember, it's not about perfection. It's about progress.
Okay, I'm feeling way more confident about part 2 now. We've conquered part 1, mastered part 2. And now it's time for the final challenge, part 3 of the IELTS speaking test.
That's right after those personal intros in part 1. And showing off your storytelling in part 2. Part 3 is where you have a deeper, more analytical discussion with the examiner.
So we're going from personal stories to bigger, more complex issues.
Exactly. Think of it as a chance to really use your critical thinking skills and share your opinions on different global topics. This is where you prove to the examiner that you can hold your own in a smart conversation.
It's like they want to see if you can go beyond just describing things. And actually analyze information and build a solid argument.
Exactly. The questions in part 3 are meant to test how well you understand complex issues and how clearly and persuasively you can express your thoughts. It's not about having the right answers. It's about showing you can think critically and have a thoughtful discussion.
Okay, so how can our listener get ready for these more analytical questions? It feels so different from parts 1 and 2.
It is different.
Yeah.
But you can definitely prepare for it. Start by getting familiar with common IELTS topics. Things like education technology, the environment, social issues.
So basically having a grasp of current events and what's happening in the world.
Right. The more you know about these topics, the easier it'll be to talk about them. Read articles, listen to podcasts, even chat with friends and family about these things. It's all about learning more and forming your own opinions.
So not memorizing facts, but understanding the world around us.
Exactly. And don't just passively take in information. Really think about the issues. What are your thoughts? Are there other viewpoints? What are some possible solutions? The more you practice this, the better prepared you'll be for part 3.
Now let's talk about structuring our answers in part 3. It's not just about saying what we think, right?
No, it's about making a well-organized argument. Think of it like writing a mini essay. You start by clearly stating your opinion, then give reasons and examples to back it up.
Can you give us an example? Like if the examiner asks, do you think technology has had a positive impact on society?
Sure, so instead of just saying, yes, it has, you'd explain why you think that. You could say, yes, I think technology has mostly had a good impact on society. It's completely changed how we communicate, improved healthcare, and made information easier to access than ever before. However, and this is where you can add some nuance, there are also worries about privacy and the possibility of people losing jobs as automation becomes more common.
That's much more sophisticated than just a yes or no. You've addressed both the good and bad sides of technology, which shows you're really thinking about the issue.
And by giving a balanced view,
Yeah.
you're proving to the examiner that you can see different sides of things.
You've also used some great vocab. Revolutionized, accessible, displacement. Well, those are the kinds of
Right.
words that'll impress the examiner.
And those words just came naturally because we were talking about this specific topic. That's why brainstorming vocabulary beforehand is so helpful. It lets you use those strong words without sounding unnatural.
You know, that reminds me of something we talked about in part 2, connecting with the examiner. Even though part 3 is more formal and analytical, is that personal connection still important?
It definitely is. Remember, the examiner's a person too. And they'll be more interested in what you have to say if you can connect with them.
So even when we're talking about serious stuff, we should still let some of our personalities show.
Right. Don't be afraid to use your voice and facial expressions. Use your hands if it feels natural. And most importantly, make eye contact. Let them see that you're confident and engaged.
You know, you just made me think of another challenge people face in part 3. What if you get a question you just don't have a strong opinion about?
That happens a lot. You might get asked about something you've never really thought about. Or maybe you just don't feel strongly one way or the other, and that's perfectly fine.
So what's the best way to handle that?
Be honest. Tell the examiner you haven't really thought about it much. But then try to offer some initial thoughts or explore different angles. You could say, that's an interesting question. I haven't really considered that before, but I guess. And then try to think out loud.
So it's more about how you think and how you approach the question, not about having a perfect answer ready to go.
Exactly. Remember, they're looking for signs of critical thinking, not just memorized answers.
Okay, that's good to know. I think a lot of test takers feel like they need to have an answer for everything, and that just makes them more nervous.
Right. But the IELTS isn't about being perfect. It's about showing you can communicate well in different situations. And sometimes that means thinking on your feet and explaining your thought process, even when you don't have all the answers.
Well, you've given us so many great tips about part 3. Any final words of encouragement before we wrap up our deep dive?
Relax, be yourself, and treat the conversation like you're talking to a friend or colleague. Remember, the examiner's not trying to trick you. They just want to see how well you can communicate in English.
That's a good point. Sometimes we forget they actually want us to do well.
Exactly. They want you to succeed. So go into that test feeling confident, knowing that you've prepared well and you have the skills to ace it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. We've learned so much, from those all-important first impressions in part 1 to the storytelling of part 2 and the thought-provoking discussions in part 3.
It was my pleasure. And for those listening who want more help, check out my IELTS Speaking Success Program. It's got practice activities, mock tests, and personalized feedback to help you reach your IELTS goals.
That's a great resource for anyone who's serious about prepping for the IELTS. And to our listener, remember, it's not just about the score. It's about developing your communication skills, broadening your horizons, and enjoying the journey of learning a new language. Go out there and rock that IELTS speaking test